Welcome to PsychCore.
Stop right there. If you've ever felt like you need to explain every single decision you make, every emotion you feel, every choice you've taken, then what I'm about to reveal in the next 15 minutes will completely transform how you see yourself and your relationships. There's a hidden psychological pattern that's silently destroying your sense of self, and most people don't even realize they're trapped in it. Carl Jung called it one of the clearest signs of a wounded psyche. And the truth is, it's affecting millions of people right now. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the moment you stop explaining yourself, your entire life changes. Welcome back to PsychCore, where we dive deep into the hidden patterns of the human mind and uncover the psychological truths that can genuinely transform your life. I'm here to break down complex concepts from psychology, philosophy, and self-development into insights you can actually use. Today, we're exploring something that Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in analytical psychology, identified as a core obstacle to becoming your true self. We're talking about the compulsive need to explain yourself, and why breaking free from it is the key to reclaiming your psychological freedom. If this resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going on a deep journey together. Let's dive in. There's a behavior that quietly dominates so many modern relationships, and most people don't even recognize it's happening. It's the constant compulsion to explain yourself, to justify your choices, your feelings, your absences, even your moods. On the surface, this seems harmless, maybe even considerate. After all, explaining yourself sounds like empathy, like you're being thoughtful toward others. But here's what most people miss. Beneath this endless need to justify yourself lies something far deeper and more troubling. It's a psychological wound that never properly healed. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in analytical psychology, identified this pattern as a clear symptom of being disconnected from your true self. He understood that when you repeatedly try to convince others about who you are, what you're feeling, and why you're acting a certain way, you're actually revealing a state of profound self-neglect. The person who constantly explains themselves is often searching for something they never received, permission to simply exist. Let me tell you where this behavior comes from. It typically develops in environments marked by emotional invalidation. These are settings, often within families, where a child's subjective experience gets systematically dismissed. The child hears things like, "That's nonsense, you're being dramatic, there's no reason to feel that way." The message that gets internalized is absolutely brutal. What I feel only matters if other people understand it, approve of it, or allow it. Over time, this belief becomes an invisible prison. The individual becomes completely dependent on other people's understanding to validate their own internal reality. When an adult compulsively explains themselves, they're unconsciously trying to prevent abandonment, judgment, or rejection. They believe that if others just understand their reasons, maybe they won't be criticized, won't be pushed away, won't be rejected. It's a desperate attempt to control how others perceive them, all to ensure they belong and feel emotionally secure. But this constant effort comes at an incredibly high price: the loss of your own psychological autonomy. When you focus all your energy on external validation, you start neglecting your internal authority. You no longer act because you believe in something. You act because you need to justify yourself to avoid being misunderstood. You stop feeling freely and start rationalizing your emotions to avoid the discomfort of being viewed negatively. Gradually, without even realizing it, you stop living for yourself and start performing for others. You become an actor in an endless theater where the audience holds more power than you, the protagonist of your own life. Jung understood this phenomenon as a central obstacle on the path to what he called individuation, which is the process by which a human being truly becomes who they are meant to be. And here's the harsh truth. As long as you feel this constant need to explain yourself, you cannot have inner freedom. Because compulsive explanation is actually a sophisticated form of submission. With each justification, you're essentially saying, I can only exist if you allow me to. This video is an invitation to dismantle that conditioning. We're going to do a deep analysis of why so many people live trapped in this need to justify themselves, and what happens when they finally choose silence. When someone decides to stop explaining themselves, something changes radically. The psyche, which was previously bent before external approval, begins to rise with a completely new posture, that of internal authority. And this transforms absolutely everything. Behind the need to explain yourself lies something much deeper than just good manners or wanting to be understood. It's a psychic wound embedded at the very core of your identity. Jung understood that this compulsion isn't just a behavioral habit, it's a symptom, a reflection of something much older. The unconscious belief that your existence only has value when it's validated by other people. This wound forms early, usually in childhood, in environments where the child's inner world is constantly delegitimized. When a child expresses sadness and is told they're being dramatic, when they show anger and are labeled as difficult or disrespectful, when they reveal fear and receive disdain or mockery in response, they begin internalizing a dangerous message. What I feel is wrong. I can only trust other people's responses. Over time, the child develops a defense mechanism. They try to be understood in order to feel safe. They learn that if they explain themselves well enough, maybe they won't be punished, ignored, or ridiculed. And so a pattern is born that gets carried into adulthood, justifying every emotion, every decision, every action, as if they need a convincing argument just to have the right to feel and to be. At the root of this wound is the loss of internal authority. The person no longer sees themselves as someone whose experience is valid in itself. They become dependent on the external gaze to confirm whether what they're living through has legitimacy or not. This creates a psychological state of submission, where self-esteem isn't built from within, but from the reflection in other people's eyes. What's important to understand is that this dynamic doesn't happen consciously. Often, people trapped in this pattern don't even realize they're constantly trying to convince others that their emotions are reasonable, that their decisions have logic, that their behavior has a valid motive. But behind every explanation lurks a hidden fear, the fear of being rejected for simply being who they are. Jung insisted that every individual needs to, at some point in life, confront this inherited internal structure. Until they do, they remain operating according to the values, judgments, and expectations of others, often internalized from authority figures in childhood, like parents, teachers, or religious leaders. The individual becomes a reflection of what others would approve of, not of who they truly are deep down. This compulsive self-explanation, therefore, is actually a form of self-abandonment. It's the act of betraying your own truth to make it more palatable, more acceptable to others. And it's precisely at this point that the healing process can begin, recognizing that you no longer need to ask for permission to exist. Your emotions, no matter how intense, contradictory, or strange they might seem, don't need to be justified to deserve space. But this awakening doesn't happen without pain. When you begin to silence yourself in the face of the urge to justify, the silence that emerges is deeply unsettling because it reveals the emptiness left by the absence of a solid internal authority. And this is exactly what Jung addresses when he introduces one of the pillars of his psychology: the construction of internal authority. Compulsive self-explanation isn't just a defense mechanism, it's a continuous act of self-betrayal. A silent betrayal, often imperceptible, but profoundly corrosive. Carl Jung understood that every time you shape your words to avoid displeasing someone, hide your emotions to maintain harmony, or suppress your decisions to avoid judgment, you're distancing yourself from yourself. You are, in fact, abandoning your own truth. This internal betrayal doesn't happen explosively, like some violent break with yourself. On the contrary, it's gradual and subtle, happening every single day. It occurs when you laugh at something you don't actually find funny, just to seem sociable. When you say yes while meaning no, because you don't want to appear selfish. When you explain your sadness as just tiredness, because you don't want to burden anyone. When you feel genuine anger, but disguise it as rational thinking, fearing you'll seem immature. With each small concession you make in the name of acceptance, a part of your soul gets left behind. Jung identified that this type of behavior is a direct reflection of an ego that's disconnected from the self. The ego, which should merely be the functional center of consciousness, becomes a servant of external acceptance. It reconfigures itself to become what others want to see, and in this constant adaptation, you lose touch with who you really are. You stop listening to your own intuition. You disbelieve your own feelings. You question your most authentic motivations. Doubt takes the place of inner confidence. This process of self-abandonment is particularly insidious because it's actually socially valued. People who adjust well, who know how to explain themselves, who avoid conflicts, who are easy to get along with. These people are often praised and rewarded. But behind this false harmony often lies deep emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who lives for others but can no longer hear themselves. Jung asserted that this type of internal fragmentation is one of the main causes of neuroses. When the ego distances itself too much from the self, which is the symbolic center of psychic wholeness, symptoms begin to emerge. Chronic anxiety, existential crises, feelings of emptiness, difficulty making decisions, persistently low self-esteem. And why does this happen? Because your soul is screaming to be heard, but it's been silenced in the name of social adaptation. Deep down, what's at stake here is a crucial question. Whose life is this anyway? As long as you're constantly seeking approval to feel, think, or act, your existence will be merely a performance, an edited version of your truth. You'll always be a character in someone else's narrative, never the author of your own story. The only way to break this cycle of self-betrayal is to reclaim your internal authority. It means developing the capacity to uphold your truth even when it's not understood, even when it causes discomfort, even when it challenges expectations. This is the beginning of true individuation, becoming whole, even if it means disappointing others. For Carl Jung, true psychological freedom doesn't arise from social acceptance or external understanding. It emerges from the development of internal authority. This concept, which is central to his theory of individuation, represents your ability to validate your own subjective experience without relying on the approval of others. It's the moment when you stop asking yourself, will they understand what I feel? And you start asserting, it doesn't matter if they understand, this is true for me. Internal authority is the complete opposite of compulsive self-explanation. While the latter is rooted in insecurity and the need to justify every step to be accepted, internal authority arises from a deep conviction that your truth doesn't need to be negotiated. And this shift isn't merely intellectual, it's existential. It's a fundamental change of axis. In practice, internal authority manifests in small daily gestures, in silence in the face of provocation, in the firmness of saying that doesn't resonate with me without needing to explain why, in refusing to participate in emotional games where you always have to justify your position. And above all, in the ability to endure the discomfort of not being understood and still remain whole. Jung believed that this is one of the most important moments of the psychological journey. The instant when you stop outsourcing your self-esteem and begin to recognize it as something that arises from within. This transition is both symbolic and powerful, as it marks the break with the old conditioned self, the one that lives to please, and the birth of a new self that's rooted, autonomous, and whole. But here's the thing. This new stance isn't well received by everyone. On the contrary, the silence that arises from internal authority often disturbs people. Those who previously benefited from your insecurity begin to lose control. Manipulators feel threatened. Relationships based on power dynamics start to crumble. And that's precisely why, when you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. Silence, when it arises from integrity and not from avoidance, is one of the most transformative forces of the human psyche. Jung understood this with brutal clarity. He saw silence not as an absence of response, but as a presence of authority. When someone stops justifying themselves compulsively, they're not just avoiding conflicts or cutting conversations short. They're deactivating an entire system of psychological control that fed on their insecurity. This type of silence is genuinely unsettling to others. Because for those who have always expected you to bow down, to explain yourself, to correct yourself, the absence of justification is interpreted as rebellion. And in a sense, it is. But it's not an immature rebellion, the kind that screams to be heard. It's a silent revolution, an implicit declaration. I owe no explanations just to be who I am. Manipulative people who feed on others' doubt begin to lose their game. Because emotional manipulation only works when there's perceptible vulnerability, when there's fear of being misunderstood, fear of being abandoned, fear of disappointing someone. Manipulation needs reactivity to function. But the secure silence that comes from internal authority is like a stone wall. It doesn't respond, doesn't justify itself, doesn't dance to anyone's music. It simply is. And this completely destabilizes any attempt at control. Moreover, relationships that have always depended on your submission, whether emotional, intellectual, or behavioral, begin to reveal themselves for what they truly are. Fragile, one-sided, based on imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you break the implicit pact of inferiority. You cease to position yourself as someone who needs to be accepted and begin to occupy the space of someone who already accepts themselves. And this changes absolutely everything. Some people will naturally distance themselves from you. And this isn't a sign of failure, it's actually a realignment. Because your silence begins to function as a filter. It reveals who was by your side out of genuine affinity, and who was only there because you were easy to control, easy to manipulate. Jung said that the process of individuation often requires ruptures, necessary breaks. And this distancing isn't punishment, it's liberation. When you stop justifying your presence, your boundaries, your choices, you start attracting relationships based on mutual respect, not on fear or dependence. But you need to be prepared for something. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you'll also have to deal with your own anxiety. The part of you that learned for decades that you needed to be understood to have value will resist this change. It will want to go back to justifying itself. It will beg you to reconsider, to explain just this once, just to smooth things over. It's at this moment that silence becomes a spiritual exercise, a conscious act of remaining whole even in the face of deep discomfort. Silence, therefore, isn't just the absence of words. It's the affirmation of being. It's the refusal to put your identity on trial. And the more you sustain this silence, the more it transforms into presence. A presence that emanates authority, that commands respect without raising its voice, that establishes boundaries without needing confrontation, a presence that doesn't need approval to exist. But the impact of silence goes far beyond your relationships with others. It initiates a profound process within your own psyche, integration. When you stop justifying yourself, you begin to actually listen to yourself. When you stop rationalizing your emotions, you start to feel them fully, completely. And that's where true transformation begins, because external silence opens up space for internal listening. There's something genuinely magnetic about a person who feels no need to explain themselves, something that cannot be faked or forced. It's about psychological integrity, the state of someone who no longer negotiates their own essence to fit external expectations. Jung understood this integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation. It's when you not only know your truth but uphold it without hesitation, without guilt, and above all, without the need for validation. An integrated person doesn't beg to be understood. They communicate, they express themselves, but they don't try to convince anyone. Because they don't start from the premise that they need to justify their existence. Their words come from a solid center, not from a hidden lack or wound. This changes everything in the way they're perceived by others. The world treats with more respect those who treat themselves with respect. And self-respect begins when you refuse to negotiate what is essential in you. Psychological integrity doesn't mean being inflexible or rigid. It means coherence. It's the ability to maintain an internal line of truth even in the face of external pressure. It's when you feel something uncomfortable in a situation, and even without being able to explain it rationally, you trust your gut feeling. You don't need to present evidence or build elaborate arguments. You simply say, "This doesn't resonate with me." And that's enough. That's complete in itself. This stance, which seems so simple, is actually revolutionary in a world where most people live disconnected from themselves. A world where decisions are made based on the opinions of others, where feelings are ignored for fear of seeming too sensitive, and where boundaries are violated with forced smiles so as not to seem difficult. Integrity is the opposite of all that. It's the art of being whole, of not fragmenting yourself to please others, of not hiding to avoid conflict. Jung knew that true transformation doesn't happen when you learn more theories or read more books. It happens when you embody a completely new stance towards life. And this stance begins with the refusal to justify yourself. Because every compulsive justification carries a camouflaged insecurity within it. The unspoken question, am I enough? The integrated person no longer asks this question. They know they are enough, even when the world insists on saying otherwise. And here lies a fascinating paradox. The less you seek approval, the more respect you naturally evoke. Because integrity has weight, it has density, it has presence. That's why, without saying a single word, a truly centered person can alter the entire dynamics of an environment. They don't need to prove anything. Their internal coherence already communicates everything that needs to be said. People like this don't beg for space in the room. They occupy it naturally. They don't react out of insecurity. They act out of alignment with themselves. But there's an essential detail here. This integrity is only possible when you stop betraying yourself. When you stop molding yourself to be accepted. When you give yourself permission to feel, to choose, to act, even if absolutely no one understands. This requires practice. It requires presence. It requires deep self-knowledge. But above all, it requires the courage to take full responsibility for your own existence without blaming others, without outsourcing your sense of value to external sources. And when this integrity finally settles in, the effects are profound and far-reaching. Your relationships change fundamentally. The way you position yourself professionally transforms. Your self-perception becomes clearer and more stable. Anxiety decreases significantly. The exhausting need to control what others think simply disappears. Because you stop living to be understood and start living to be true. Thank you for being here, for doing this inner work, and for choosing to become more authentically you. I'll see you in the next video.